There are places no map dares to mark, deep stretches of forest where sunlight barely reaches, and there are things no one wants to speak of, because just saying their names might awaken something sleeping in the dark. We thought it would be just another camping trip, a few nights in nature, a campfire, laughter, and some spooky stories shared under the stars, but we were wrong. Dead wrong. We thought it would be just another camping trip, a few nights in nature, a campfire, laughter, and some spooky stories shared under the stars, but we were wrong. Dead wrong. This is the story of our last camping trip in West Virginia.
It's been about 6 years since that camping trip in West Virginia, back when I was in high school, but the memory remains crystal clear, the kind that sends shivers down your spine even on the warmest days. There were 6 of us, myself, Jake, Travis, Cooper, Matt, and Derek. We were all 17, invincible in that only way teenagers can be, and completely unprepared for what we would encounter in those woods. We'd crashed at Jake's place the night before, sprawled across his basement floor in sleeping bags, listening to the rain hammering against the windows. The storm had been relentless, dumping water until about 8 a.m. when it finally let up, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. The plan was to camp in the woods near his house, a spot we'd been to countless times before, but never quite like this. By 1 p.m., we'd loaded up 2 four-wheelers with our gear, attaching a wagon to haul our tents, coolers, and enough junk food to feed an army. The air felt wrong from the start. You know that feeling right before a massive thunderstorm? That electric charge that makes the hair on your arms stand up? It was like that, but worse. The clouds hung low and heavy, an oppressive ceiling of gray that seemed to press down on us. The muggy air carried this metallic smell, like ozone and wet copper. The trail we usually took was about 3 miles long, winding through dense forest and across a couple of small creeks. We'd made the trip dozens of times, but that day, everything felt different. The woods were quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but the rumble of our four-wheelers and the squelch of tires through mud. About halfway in, we stopped for a break. Travis pulled out his cigarettes, and we passed around some sodas, trying to shake off the weird vibe that had settled over us. And that's when it happened. The first sign that something was off. Maybe 40 yards down the trail, something dark and fast darted across the path. We all saw it, but nobody wanted to be the first to admit that it wasn't just a deer. The movement was purposeful and fluid. The journey that usually took us an hour stretched into nearly 3. Fallen trees blocked our usual routes, forcing us to find detours. The creeks were swollen with the rain, making crossings treacherous. And by the time we reached our camping spot, the weak afternoon sun was already starting to fade, casting long shadows through the trees. It was around 4 p.m., but it felt later, like the darkness was eager to claim the day. We were quickly to set up camp, nobody wanting to admit that we were still all on edge. The tents went up, and we started gathering wood for a fire. That's when Cooper froze, pointing toward a dense stand of trees about 50 yards away. At first, we thought he was joking. There appeared to be what looked like a massively tall deer standing on its hind legs. We laughed nervously, the kind of laugh you force out when you're trying to convince yourself that everything's fine. But then, it moved. What we saw next defied explanation. The figure was easily 10 feet tall. It didn't just run away. It moved with an almost human-like grace, bipedal, its long limbs carrying it through the forest with a terrifying speed. The movement was smooth, deliberate, nothing like a deer or a bear trying to walk upright. In the fading light, its dark silhouette disappeared into the trees, leaving us in a stunned silence. Now, we spent the rest of that evening huddled close to the fire, jumping at every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear, maybe a trick of the light, our imaginations running wild, but deep down inside, we all knew better. While we never saw it again during that trip, the feeling of being watched never left. We barely slept that night, taking turns keeping the fire going until dawn. The next morning, we packed up faster than we'd ever broken camp before. The weird atmospheric conditions had cleared, but our nerves hadn't. On the ride back, we made a pact not to tell anyone what we'd seen. I mean, who'd believe 6 teenagers anyway? But sometimes when we get together now, years later, someone will bring up that day, and the conversation gets quiet, and we all remember that thing in the woods, standing extremely tall among the trees, moving in a way nothing natural should move. Now, to this day, I won't camp in those woods again. Some things you see change you forever, and some questions, well, sometimes they're better left unanswered. But looking back now, there are details from that night that I've tried to forget. Things that didn't make sense at the time and make even less sense now. During our fire watch shifts, we heard sounds we couldn't explain. Not the usual forest noises. These were different. Around 2 a.m. during my shift with Jake, we heard what sounded like wood cracking, but not like a branch breaking under weight. It was more deliberate, like something was systematically snapping trees. The sounds came from different directions, as if whatever was out there was circling our camp. Matt swears he saw eyes reflecting our flashlight beams during his watch, not at ground level where you'd expect from a coyote or a deer, but way up in the canopy, at least 8 feet off the ground. Derek, who'd always been the skeptic of our group, the one who could rationalize anything, went completely quiet after his shift. To this day, he refuses to talk about what he saw or heard while everyone else was sleeping. But it was what we found the next morning that really cemented the terror of that night. You see, as we were rushing to pack up camp, Travis discovered something that made my blood run cold. About 30 yards from our campsite, we found a perfect circle of dead vegetation, maybe 15 feet in diameter. Every plant within that circle was withered and black, like it had been drained of life overnight. The ground felt strange too. It was super hard. It was almost crystallized. Cooper took a picture of it on his flip phone, but when he tried to show it to us later, the image was just blurry. The strange part? Right in the center of that circle was a single massive footprint, if you could even call it that. It was nearly 2 feet long, but it didn't match any animal track we'd ever seen. It was too narrow for a bear, too wide for a deer, and had what looked like 6 distinct toe impressions. The edges were crisp, like it had been pressed into clay, but the ground was rock solid. When we got back to Jake's house, we discovered our compasses were all demagnetized, pointing in different directions. The batteries in our flashlights, all of them brand new before the trip, were completely dead. Travis's watch had stopped at 3:33 in the morning, although he swears it was working fine when he checked the time during his watch at 4. We tried researching similar incidents in the area after we got home. The local library had some old newspapers from the 1950s that mentioned a series of unexplained livestock disappearances in those same woods. There were also reports of strange lights and unusual weather patterns, but nothing concrete enough to explain what we'd encountered. The weird aftermath of all this: about a week later, all 6 of us developed the same strange marking on our left wrists. 3 small dots in a triangular pattern, like tiny bruises that faded after a few days. We never talked about those marks to anyone else. Jake's family moved away the following year, selling their property to developers. And the last I heard, they tried to clear those woods for a housing project, but equipment kept malfunctioning, and workers refused to stay after dark. The development was eventually abandoned, and the official reason was environmental concerns. But I've always wondered if they'd maybe encountered something out there too. Now these days I work as a forest ranger in Colorado, about as far from those West Virginia woods as I could get. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm out on patrol, I'll catch a whiff of that same metallic smell in the air, or I'll hear wood cracking in that deliberate way. In those moments, I know with absolute certainty that what we encountered that night wasn't unique to those woods. Now last month, something happened that forced me to confront everything I tried to forget about that night. I received a letter from Cooper, the first time any of us had communicated by actual mail. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that read, "I've been doing research. We weren't the only ones. Call me." The USB contained hundreds of files, newspaper clippings, forum posts, and personal accounts spanning decades, all centered around those West Virginia woods. Cooper had become obsessed with finding answers, and what he uncovered was disturbing. The pattern was always the same: the metallic smell, electrical disturbances, and sightings of impossibly tall figures moving through the trees. But there was more. In 1887, a logging camp of 20 men vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their equipment and a journal describing watchers in the canopy. In 1932, 3 geological surveyors reported finding a series of cave systems with walls that seemed to pulse with their own light. They disappeared 3 days later. In 1978, a group of college students conducting an environmental study found perfectly circular patches of dead vegetation, just like we did. They also reported strange marks on their wrists that faded after a few days. But the most chilling discovery was a series of photographs from 1994. A wildlife researcher had set up motion-triggered cameras throughout the area. Most of the photos showed nothing unusual: deer, bears, the occasional fox. But one image showed something that made my hand shake when I first saw it. Standing in the background, partially obscured by trees, was a figure that matched exactly what we'd seen. The proportions were all different. The head, if you could call it that, was elongated and seemed to be turned completely backwards. The researcher disappeared shortly after submitting these photos to his university. The official investigation concluded he'd been a victim to a bear attack, though they never found a body. Cooper also tracked down Jake's family. They hadn't just moved away randomly. They'd fled. Jake's father finally told Cooper the truth. In the weeks following our camping trip, they'd been experiencing strange phenomena around their house. Outside objects would move on their own. Jake's little sister talking about the tall people who would watch her through her second-story window at night. And the final straw came when they found those same 3-dot triangle marks on her wrist one morning. I called Cooper after reviewing everything. He told me he'd used facial recognition software to track down photos of everyone who'd reported similar encounters in those woods over the past 30 years. The results were unsettling. In every photo taken after their experience, the people had a haunted look about them, not just in their eyes, but something fundamentally changed in their features. When he showed me my own driver's license photo compared to one from before that night, I saw it too. It's subtle, but there's something different about our faces now, like we're carrying a shadow that we can't shake. Derek finally broke his silence last week. He called me in the middle of the night, his voice shaking. He'd seen it again, not in West Virginia, but in Minnesota where he lives now. He was driving home late from work when he caught that familiar metallic smell, and looking in his rearview mirror, he saw something impossibly tall standing by the road, its elongated head turned toward his car. He drove straight to the airport and flew to his sister's house in Florida. If you ask Travis, he thinks that they're studying us, and Matt believes they're preparing for something bigger. But Cooper's research suggests that they've been here longer than us, using the woods as some kind of gateway or observation point. Jake hasn't responded to any of our messages in months. His social media went dark after he posted a single photo of his backyard in Seattle, where a familiar circle of dead vegetation can be seen in the background. And then there's me. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know this: those woods in West Virginia aren't just haunted by what we saw that night. They're haunted by what saw us. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my ranger station, I'll catch movement in my peripheral vision. Something tall. All I know, that whatever we encountered that night has been following all of us, watching us. I'm writing this all now because I found a circle of dead vegetation outside my station yesterday. In the center was a familiar footprint with 6 toes. Above it, scored deep into a tree trunk, was a perfect triangle of 3 dots. I've been thinking about those woods, trying to remember every detail before the strange events overshadowed everything else. The forest there was different from any I've encountered since, even in all my years as a ranger. The trees were old-growth hardwoods, massive oaks and hickories that had stood for centuries, some of their trunks wider than car tires. The canopy was so dense that even on the brightest days, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The ground was always damp, covered in a thick layer of decomposing leaves that muffled our footsteps. Moss grew everywhere, not just on the north side of trees, but in thick carpets that spread across fallen logs and rocks. And the air had this rich, earthy smell, like mushrooms and wet bark, mixed with the sweet decay of old leaves. There were also these peculiar rock formations too, natural features that seemed to form rough corridors through the woods. The locals called them whalebacks. They were long, curved ridges of weathered sandstone that rose up from the forest floor like the spines of buried giants. Water would seep out from their bases, creating little springs that fed the creeks. The undergrowth of the forest was thick with rhododendrons, huge ones, not like the decorative bushes you see in gardens. These were more like trees, with twisted trunks and branches that formed tunnels you could almost walk through. Their leaves were dark and waxy, reflecting what little light made it through the canopy in ways that played tricks on your eyes. But what strikes me most now is how the forest seemed to absorb sound. Not just muffle it, but consume it entirely. You could shout, and your voice would travel maybe half as far as it should have. The birds we did hear sounded distant, even though they were right overhead of us. It was like the woods themselves were hungry for noise. I remember this one tree near our campsite that stood out from all the others. It was a massive white oak, but its trunk had grown in a spiral pattern, like a giant twist of rope reaching for the sky. The bark was deeply furrowed, creating shadows that seemed to shift even when there was no wind. None of us wanted to camp too close to it, though nobody said why. And honestly, we didn't know any better. We were stupid 17-year-olds at the time, and that was really the only forest that we knew. The forest changed as night fell. During the day, you could at least pretend it was normal woods. But darkness transformed it into something ancient and aware. The spaces between trees became solid walls of black, and the branches overhead wove themselves into abstract patterns against the sky. The darkness had a weight to it, pressing against our flashlight beams like something alive. Now, even now, I can close my eyes and feel the specific texture of those woods. The way the ground gave slightly under each step, the cool dampness that clung to your skin, the peculiar resistance in the air when you moved too quickly. It wasn't just a forest. It was a place that had evolved in isolation. I still often wonder if the strange thing we saw was just the woods themselves, finding a way to move, to reach out and touch the intruders in its midst. But that's the kind of thought that keeps you awake at night, staring at a ceiling, listening to the wind and the trees outside your window, and hoping it really is just the wind.
That camping trip changed everything. The memories still cling to us, as if the forest has never truly let us go. If you're still here, if you're still listening, then maybe the darkness has already started to notice you too. Don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following us as we uncover more strange, chilling, and mysterious tales hiding in the shadows. Because what you just heard is only the beginning. Subscribe before something else finds you.